we are going to go to you. Perhaps we can start with a little bit about yourself, Erik, and AIHR and what you're doing at AIHR.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Neely and Joe. I'm very, very excited, very stoked to be here as well. I'm Erik van Vulpen. I'm the founder of AIHR, short for the Academy to Innovate HR, as Joe said. And we provide upskilling for HR professionals, whether that's in people analytics, in digital HR, or in any functional competencies. We upskill HR professionals, make sure that they know what understand the business, help drive business results through excellent HR practices. So that's essentially what we do.
Brilliant. And just to kick us off, Erik, I kind of recently saw it mentioned that through COVID-19 and especially the kinds of things we're going through right now, someone said that the CHRO, that role has really been pushed to becoming the second in command at many organizations today. So if you think about how a lot of organizations tackled COVID, really the CHRO was so implicated in that. Would you agree though that the CHRO has a new role today, given what's going on?
Yeah, definitely. Especially if you look, when the pandemic just started, I think the CHRO was thrusted into the breach and was the first one to, not just him or herself, of course, but, HR as a department was thrusted into the role of, driving around computers, trying to solve emergency situations, making sure that experts were, sent home in a good way, making sure that the employees essentially were safe and could continue the business, in a safe condition. So definitely from that perspective, the HR function has become very, very important in dealing with the current, essentially with the pandemic and the changes that happened with that. I think during the pandemic, HR has been very much focused on work from home policies, helping people to work from home more effectively, but also on a strategic level, where engagement and retention was, very much an HR topic, and not always that much emphasis was put upon it, from a board perspective. Now, when the majority or part of the population is working from home, the CEO is laying awake at night thinking, how do I keep my people engaged? How do I retain them when they're not in the office and talking with each other, on a daily basis at the coffee machine? So from that sense, I think the CHRO has become much, much more strategic. And I think it's a responsibility for the CHRO to not only think now in damage control mode, but also look, forward towards the future. How can HR keep that strategic position also towards a future where normalcy is hopefully, we see some early indications, is hopefully returning.
Yes. So Erik, continuing actually a little bit on that, in an excellent, if I may say, recent article that you wrote, you talk about, I believe, 5 ways that HR can basically become better out of this crisis. And so among other things, you say that, of course, the COVID crisis has dramatically changed the way many organizations conduct business, but also the way HR professionals manage their workforce. Now, you mentioned 2 typical ways for us human beings to respond or to act in a crisis situation. And you make a really interesting reference, I think, to the Vietnam War. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, sure. So it was a while ago when I was reading a few articles, and it was about the conditions after the Vietnam War. And as you may know, a lot of the soldiers that came back from the war were, shells of their former selves. They had seen horrible scenes in Vietnam, has lived through incredible danger, and came back as a shell of their former selves. The person who went to Vietnam was fundamentally different from the person who came back, and the person who came back was not necessarily a better person. And that's essentially where the research started in this topic. And this, it used to be called shell shock. It was labeled post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's a response to very harsh, very stressful conditions, and that an individual is unable to recover from. But the interesting thing was that there was also a group of people who came back from Vietnam who through the horrors that they lived through, acquired a newly acquired appreciation of life. They came back. They lived through those horrors, and they saw that the life they were, living in as something given, something extra. They could really appreciate, their newfound freedom coming back from the war. And this puzzled psychologists for quite some time, until they labeled it a post-traumatic growth. So you have these two kinds of, it's a little bit simplified, but these two kinds of reactions. On the one hand, you have individuals who go through stress and then don't really recover from it, so that performance, goes down and stays low. And you have these individuals that have a stressful moment, but then, through that they are resilient, they bounce back, and they not just bounce back, but they grow through it. They learn something new through the crisis. And I thought that analogy was very interesting also for the current COVID pandemic, because if we look in businesses, the way HR has reacted is very much, an ad hoc focus on making sure that the business keeps running. And now my question is, with the potential of getting out of the pandemic in a couple of months, hopefully in a year we're out of it, how can we, what behaviors do we as an HR organization and as HR professionals, what behaviors do we need to show in order to be resilient and bounce back and grow through the pandemic?
I think that's interesting, Erik, in terms of how you put it. Like, there's going to be different impacts on different organizations. Not every organization is going to come out of COVID the same. Some are going to come out weaker. Some might come out actually stronger with a new way of seeing business and the world.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly that. So are you able to grow through it? And are you able now already to make the decisions that, the new normal, hopefully in 3 to 6 months, you are prepared for those challenges now already, instead of still focusing on more ad hoc issues on how do we get people back? And I think that's where a very big gap is, that HR is not really thinking strategically about, the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. And now is the time to start thinking about this and to start thinking, how can we grow through, the current situation in a successful way?
Yes. And I believe, Erik, that you, as I mentioned before, you see several ways for HR to come out of this crisis stronger and to transform at the same time. And one of the things you mention is resilience building HR practices. Perhaps you can tell us what this is about, these practices.
Yeah, so I propose five solutions. And the first one is more of a short-term solution, and it's focused on resilience building HR practices. Resilience is this concept of, you get hit and you bounce back. So you return to the status quo after a short while. Resilience, research shows that during a stressful time like a pandemic, individuals who are resilient are able to recover, are happier, are less prone to become depressed. They are able to cope better with the difficulties that life throws at them, essentially. So on the short term, I think there's still a lot of value for HR to build resilience in its employees. And we have we have quite a good idea of what builds resilience. One of them is what is often popularized as the growth mindset, an openness to new experiences, instead of seeing the here and now as a fixed situation that will stay the same. Seeing it with a growth mindset, seeing it with the big five, we call it an openness to experience. Being able to adapt to new situations and trying to find a positive in that new status quo. That is one of those are two drivers. Having a growth mindset, growing through it, and being open-minded in order to be able to rephrase the reality, the mental schematic, so to say, in life. And also the openness to new experiences is one of the key drivers to post-traumatic growth. And also when it comes to engagement building practices, we know that engagement has always been very important for HR, not always equally important for the business. Engagement is a key driver for resilience. And I would say the fourth key driver is building a good digital employee experience, where a lot of the employee experiences practices that we have, are focused on the employee, driving up, coming into the office. Quite some employees are now at the moment not in the office. So how do we create a digital employee experience and make sure that that helps people get engaged, and through engagement build this resilience again? So those, I would say, are four very practical ways to build this resilience in order to be able to bounce back.
Super interesting, very practical information, Erik. That's awesome. We're going to touch on that part around digital and that whole part around enabling digital upskilling again in a moment. But I was interested to kind of bring it back to the HR department itself. And here in today's episode, we're kind of talking about HR's role in transforming the organization and leading the organization out of the crisis. But I know you talked in that article about the transformation of the HR function itself. What can you tell us about that? What's important for HR people to think about in transforming their own department?
Yeah, I think that is the critical question. So what are we going to do today so that, in half a year from now, we come out of this situation stronger and more strategically? As I said, when we got into the pandemic, I think a lot of organizations, dropped everything, and rightly so, especially in HR, they dropped everything and they started, driving around with monitors and making sure that everyone had the right equipment, which at the moment was a good response. Now it should be about, our response today on the pandemic should be, what are the capabilities that we need in 6 to 12 months, and how are we going to make sure that we have them by the time that we need them, and which hard and difficult decisions do we need to make today that will enable us to be successful in 6 to 12 months. And that's really for me where this comes from. And if HR needs to transform, I don't know the exact number, but I think it was research from 2020. 68% of HR leaders, specifically in the technology sector, so that's usually a leading sector, 68% of HR leaders knew that they needed to transform, but only 1/3 of them thought they actually had the capability to transform. So you're already seeing that these leading organizations who usually hire the best and the brightest only feel that 1/3 has the actual ability to transform and has the team and the setting to do that. So when you think about reorganizing, reinventing HR, I think upskilling within the HR organization is a critical part of that. HR needs to understand the transformation that it's going through, and very often this is a digital transformation. HR needs to understand it. HR needs to own this, and I think that is one of the key ways to get out of this in a more successful way. It's about upskilling the HR departments. And one conversation I had recently with an HR director, she was heading 80 people in HR. And I was talking to her, and she said, I have this one person who has this skill set. He knows how to automate workflows. And she said, this guy, he has work for years, on his backlog. If I could, get 9 more, and I'm actually planning on getting 9 more of these of this profile. I will only need 60 people in my team, but as long as I have 10 people with this role, with this capability that this person has, I can actually slim down, make my department leaner while being as productive, if not more productive with less people. And I think that's a very good example of how an HR organization can reinvent itself and transform through building new skills that we all know that we need, but now I think today we need them even more urgently, especially, as the employee experience is also becoming, both in real life and also digital with the new working from home situation post-COVID.
Yes, Erik, thank you. Super interesting. And I'd like to unpack, if possible, what kind of capabilities you believe then that HR needs, because you say it starts with the upskilling of HR itself. What kind of capabilities, what kind of skills are we thinking about? Do you have an idea about that?
Yeah, we have a pretty good idea about that. So we define this HR professional that is ready in 2025 as the T-shaped HR professional. T-shaped as, they have a broad number of core capabilities, and they have, the stem of the T, they have a functional specialization. These core capabilities, we have identified 4 of them. They're the people's advocate. So, HR practitioners need to understand how to build a culture, how to communicate, how to be a trusted advisor of employees, how to be an employee champion. The second one is a business understanding, business acumen, we call it. As an HR professional, you need to have a deep understanding of the business. Now, these first 2 are not necessarily unique. You need them, you've needed them for the past 30 or so years already. The third core competency that we've identified is being data-driven. So being able to make better decisions driven by data. And then the fourth element is digital integration. Are we able to leverage technology to make our current HR processes more efficient and more effective? And with those 4 core capabilities, the HR practitioner, depending on their functional specialization, of course, but they have at least the core skills they need in order to be successful in the near future. And the analogy that I like to use is, flying a plane. And if you fly a plane, you need 4 elements. You need to know where you're going, which is business acumen. You need to be able to, interpret the dashboard and look at your dashboard, and be able to steer the plane. That's essentially how most pilots fly these days. They don't look outside, but they look on their dashboards, which is essentially, being data driven. It's about, trusting an autopilot, having an autopilot, because most of the time they're just drinking coffee or napping, and the autopilot is on, which is the digital integration. But it's also, when shit hits the fan and you need to look out through the window, you need to know where you are, you need to locate where you are. You still need that visual acumen, which is, understanding people and understanding the people processes. So those are for us the 4 key elements that HR in a digital future really needs to have.
In order to drive that transformation of the organization, I might add.
In order to be future-proof, because in the end, a transformation is also a means to an end. So a transformation is a way to make the organization have more impact, be leaner, be more agile, be more effective, whatever it is that the transformation is trying to achieve. And HR needs to drive that and enable that transformation only if it, of course, makes sense for the business. But yeah, especially post pandemic, there are, and also at the moment, there are a lot of organizations that really need to go through that transformation in order to have some right of existence, in order to be a viable business. So for those businesses, yes, HR should help and maybe even be the driver's seat of the transformation. And HR can do this by transforming itself.
No, very good points. I think if we just sum up those 4, because I think it's such a great summary for the people listening in. You talked there about HR being people advocates, being, really, really having that business acumen as well. And those are the 2 that have kind of, as you said, always been around the last 30 years. But then really data-driven and a focus on digital are these new core competencies that HR needs to have. I think, Erik, it makes sense to really dive into that digital element now, actually.
I just wanted to say, Joe, that you did such a great job at wrapping it up, for the listeners. I mean, that's usually what I do, but yeah, I think you did a really good job at that.
Yeah, look, I've learned from you, Nearly. I've learned from the master.
Yeah.
So yeah, Erik, I think it makes sense since we're starting to get very digital in our discussion now, which is cool, to focus on that piece around enabling digital upskilling. So you mentioned that in the article we've been referring to. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by this? I think you gave us a little bit of a preview before, but why is the focus on digital from the HR department so important?
That's something we can spend hours on, Joe. The digital is crucial. I think that the aim of digital, we call this, the digital integration capability or competency. The aim of that is to make HR policies more efficient and more effective, and in the end have that result in business impact. And that can be very simple. So I still know organizations that are working with pen and paper based processes. If you have any of those processes around, it's about time to get them automated. And there's more of them around than you would initially think. if you talk about, the more mundane and administrative focused HR processes, where most HR organizations, spend most time and most manpower on these administrative processes, in 5 to 10 years, those processes for the majority are fully automated. At least if you make sure that you are leading the pack. So there is a significant change coming, and for HR professionals, they need to understand this. They need to be able to implement this, because technology implementation is something that is, now happening every now and again, or probably quite constant actually, but it will be only more continuously and more constant. So as an HR professional, you need to be able to implement technology. So to understand it, to implement it, and especially if you're a more senior HR professional, you need to understand how it can drive, HR impact and business impact from a more macro, from an helicopter view, understand how these different systems interact with each other, what data they generate, how you can leverage that data to make better decisions. That's that entire data value chain you need to start understanding. But there's also a second component to it, which is upskilling, the business in digital skills. I read a survey, I think it was a 2019 survey. I don't know who exactly did it, but they found that the number one key competency that the workforce in general needed was digital adaptation. So essentially the ability to adapt different digital tools. So, first of all, HR needs to become more digital itself, but HR also plays a key role in making the workforce more digital. And I think those are the two really key elements that HR should build on.
I'm interested to know, Erik, on that. Where do you think HR people stand today with this? The HR people you work with, where are we at with these digital skills? Is it the very beginning, or are we somewhere along the line?
I think we have a lot to learn. And this learning is partially because a lot of HR professionals are still at the very beginning. I think it's also because there's not really an endpoint at the moment. We can, define, we work with a lot of organizations and we ask them, what does, your HR professional, your ideal HR professional look like? And then we map it out. We say, okay, that's where you want to go. This is where you are now. How can we fill that gap? But by the time that people are, 1-2 years ahead and they are at that point, the new requirement for especially digital skills will have moved. We don't yet know how, because that is the future, but that's kind of a given that the border where you want to go will only start to will only be pushed, will only be increased. So it is hard to define where people need to go. I think in general, when it comes to having a digital understanding, a lot of HR professionals can still learn a lot.
Very politically correct answer, Erik. Basically, how bad is the situation? We still have a lot to learn. Love it. Anyhow, Erik, so I was wondering, since we are now talking about organizations that you work with and what you're seeing when you talk to organizations, could you perhaps share an example or maybe two of organizations that you see doing a really good job already at driving the transformation of their organization in 2021? No need to call any names if you can't, but just maybe you can share an example that you've come across, if any.
Yeah, sure. So this morning I was on a call with the CHRO of a large organization, and they were implementing a new human resource information system. They were going from an old on-premise build to a software or a cloud-based solution. And they were, on the one hand doing that, while on the other hand also actively exploring how they could upskill their people in more data-driven and more digital skills. Because they understand, and I think that's a good example. They understand that the system, the technology, and the people essentially go hand in hand. And that's also how a lot of the organizations that we work with, that we help, they are in similar trajectories where they upgrade their current systems, and with the extra capabilities that these new systems enable, they also upskill their people to ensure that they are able to read that data that comes from these new dashboards. And I think this is summarized quite well by an HR director I spoke a while ago. And one of his biggest frustrations was that HR business partners went to managers, spoke to managers. He said, Erik, what annoys me is that they go to their managers and they go with an empty block note. And they essentially ask the manager, what can I do for you today? And they scribble down, the things that they can do, and they start doing it. And he says to me, Erik, I really want these business partners to do it the other way around. I want them to first look at the systems. We have a new dashboard. I want them to work with these dashboards, scribble down all the problem areas, when it comes to people for this manager, but also when it comes to these managers' KPIs. And then go to the manager with a filled-in block note and sit down with the manager and say, I have a plan to improve your performance, and you're going to do it by increasing retention, by decreasing absence, by helping boost productivity, which is one of your key performance drivers, by etc. So how do you, on the one hand, you need that technology to have the data available, to have it accessible by everyone. On the other hand, you also need the skills. And that's a lot of organizations that we work with often implement the technology and then see that there's no real uptake in people using it, and then really come looking and try to upskill their people as well. I think the best practice is definitely to upgrade your technology while at the same time upskill your people in data-driven, more digital skills.
That's a really interesting point there, Erik, around HR business partners actually feeling like they have a strategy to bring to the table, rather than just, in a sense, being a servant to the managers and just doing whatever the managers would want them to do. And I think you touched on data there again, and it's come up a few times in this conversation. I'm interested to understand, HR has so much data available to it in a lot of cases, depending on the technology you have. But I have the sense that, HR doesn't always use that data to its full potential. Is there any areas of focus where data could actually serve HR in the businesses if there's one or two priorities there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very good question. I think also a question where a lot of HR professionals and organizations or HR organizations go wrong. Going back to the analogy with, of the airplane, your data is essentially, your dashboards with all the different meters and altitude meters. And I'm not a pilot, so I don't know all the elements on an airplane's dashboard. And most of the buttons and the switches and the meters there, you don't really use them. As long as you know your altitude and your direction, your speed, you're mostly there. But when shit hits the fan, you need to know where the buttons are, to solve those issues. And they may be buttons, to extinguish an engine fire, which hopefully you'll never use in your career. But you need to know where that button is. And I think that's also where how you should look at data. There are a number of KPIs. They will be different for depending on the company, but there are a number of KPIs that you want to keep an eye out continuously. There are a number of metrics and KPIs that you probably will never look at only when the business needs arrive. So when your engine goes in fire, you want to make sure that that beeping sound and that light that is blinking, that your engine is on fire, that you notice it and that you react on it and take action on it. And I think that's also how organizations should, and especially the HR department should look at metrics and KPIs. They need to define what are the key performance indicators that help us boost business performance, which is a very hard exercise, but a vital exercise to do. That's probably a fairly short list, and they need to put a target on it and try to improve those key performance drivers. On the one hand, and on the other hand, there is a lot of data available, yes, but most of that data is best left, I would say, untouched until the business need arrives. So really try to focus on this business urgency. Don't look at your data first, look at the business first. Think, how can we, help the business? What are the key performance or the key strategic priorities in the business? And how can we link the key performance, HR key performance drivers that in the end help drive the business, those business outcomes?
Thank you, Erik. I think we are starting to get to the end of our conversation. I have one more thing that I'd like to talk to you about, because of course we've talked a lot as well about organizational transformation during this conversation. Now, by and large, what sort of organizational transformation should a newly empowered HR professional, perhaps CHRO, be trying to drive, in your opinion, as a priority in 2021? Now, one thing that comes to my mind is what you mentioned earlier about creating a digital employee experience. Perhaps it's related to that. Perhaps it's, in your opinion, related to something completely different. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Neely. And the connection broke a bit, so I don't know if I got it 100%. But I think your question is, how can a CHRO find the right priorities when it comes to a digital transformation? And then my answer would be, that depends very much on the business issues at hand. So some organizations may have, may want to enable working from home, permanently after the COVID pandemic. So then, you might want to focus on working from home policies. Other organizations, this morning I read a study from 2018 that looked at which percentage of the population, if they work from home 1 day a week, will significantly drop in productivity. And for countries like China and India, these percentages were well over 50%. So more than 50% of the population essentially can't work from home because it's just not feasible. So if you work, in those kinds of industries, oftentimes more services, in-person services, blue collar focused, or healthcare services, policing, fire extinguishers. You can't, be a fireman from home. Those kinds of, if you're in that kind of organization, you won't be focusing on working from home. You'll probably be focusing on other issues. At the moment, you'll be focusing on how can you create a safe workplace. In half a year, you'll be focusing on other pressing matters. So it is very hard to say, this is your starting point as a CHRO, because it will depend very, very much on your organization. Whether you work in a factory setting, in a professional services firm, that will be significantly different. In the end, what you start with in a transformation is a means to an end. So you want to enable the business. And if the business decides, we're going to fully automate our service offering, which will, also indicate or mean that all the different services like marketing, finance, and HR also need to automate to a certain extent, then, that is your priority and that is your digital transformation as an HR leader, which is very different from an organization that has yet another priority. So the priority that you focus on very much depends on the business that you are in and the strategic priorities that you have. So it's very hard to put one stamp of, we all need to start working from home. What we do need to do is start thinking like, are we able to work from home? And if so, for example, to stick to the work from home example, if so, is it desirable, if people are able to work from home, is it desirable that people work from home? And, to what extent is it desirable that people work from home 5 days a week, even though, in the pandemic it went great, to what degree is that desirable? Or do we see that the number of new ideas or innovations, is decreasing, so that on the long run, we need to make sure that people are really in the office? So there's a lot of complexity to it. It's hard to give one single answer. It really depends on your business needs.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, Erik, and one that we're hearing come through more and more in this first season of the Ins and Outs of Work podcast, is that there's not one size fits all answer to these issues. And actually, as an HR leader and as an HR professional, it kind of takes you really understanding your business, talking to people, understanding your people, and working from there. And I even liked what you were saying about data. It's like, it's not, don't start with the data, start with the business and start with the people, and then figure out what you want to drive. Great perspectives. Erik, I've just got one last question for you, and it's what we always like to do to finish off these episodes, is to leave our listeners with a challenge. So I don't know if you have a challenge that you'd like to leave our listeners with when it comes to HR transforming businesses.
Oh, a question. I would ask the question, what can you do today to get out of the pandemic stronger in 6 to 12 months? And I think every HR professional, especially if you're in a strategic role, every CHRO should have a good answer to that question. What are the elements that you want to focus on in order to get out of the pandemic stronger? And that will again very much depend on the business priorities that you have, but it will also require making tough decisions about what is desirable when it comes to working from home. Is it desirable if we work from home 4 out of 5 days? What is the support that we need to provide to our people when they return either from working to home back to the office? Is there support that they need? How can we be a more people-centric organization? So there's so many issues, and I think we can spend yet another entire podcast on trying to answer that question. But that's the question that I would like to give to the listeners at home. What are the things you can do today to realize that post-traumatic growth instead of not having that resilience and staying in a lower gear and not being able to get back to where you were before the crisis hit?
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, and I think...
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
So good. And I think we've come kind of full circle. We talked about the Vietnam War at the start, post-traumatic stress, and we've come right back around. It's amazing. Any final thoughts from you, Neely?
No, absolutely love the conversation. Erik, a pleasure as always. That's it from me, Joe.
So good. Well, thank you so much, Erik. And before we leave you listeners, we just wanted to encourage you that if you are enjoying this podcast, please do feel free to subscribe, leave a rating, and share it with a friend. We would so appreciate that. Otherwise, we're going to see you again next week. Bye.